Hold on.
Hey, Mick. David.
Pete, how are you?
Hey, Zeb,
Yes.
is there any chance that when we go to do the pledge that we just let let's see, it's Jordan tonight, do the talking and the rest of us just mouth it or something? Isn't it distracting when we're all doing this?
We're not in harmony for sure.
No.
So
if we just listen to Jordan and move our lips, we're good. Is that okay?
We can do that. If Jordan, how about this? You'll do the prayer, and then we'll let you lead in the Pledge of Allegiance as well, and we'll stand in observance of the beauty and the awe of your voice.
I've been doing that all along. Who knew other people were?
Well, I'm hearing like everybody in a different, like we're all over the place. We're doing a wave.
I think that's a good idea. Yeah, that's a good idea.
I guess we could just be mute and then nobody else can hear us except we can hear
Right.
Jordan.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Or you could just stand in quiet observance while Jordan takes the lead. That's a great idea.
Puts a lot of pressure on me, you guys.
Don't mess it up. I know there was at one point in time, I think Mr. Stolley and I heard somebody screw up the national anthem at one point in time. I can't remember who that was.
Yeah, I've seen that one too. I've seen that happen.
Yeah, I think it was at some local Republican dinner. So,
ouch.
Yeah. We're not on. Well, I guess, yeah, we're about on here. Okay. We are live on Facebook. Do we have everybody here? Yep. So let's go ahead and call this meeting to order. The Bellefontaine City Council is now in session. Please rise for the invocation and the Pledge of Allegiance by Councilman Jordan Reeser.
Will you bow your heads with me? Dear God, with Veterans Day upon us, we are reminded of the blessings of the strong, brave, and selfless people who protect and defend America. May you watch over and protect all who have served, are serving, and will serve our great country. We pray for everlasting peace in the U.S. and the world. May you guide us tonight in our decision-making to do the best work for the city of Bellefontaine. In your name, amen.
Amen.
And pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
May be seated. Thank you, Mr. Reeser. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Springs,
Here.
Mrs. Baker,
Here.
Mr. DeSalma, Mrs. James,
Here.
Mr. Kurtz,
Here.
Mr. Lau,
Here.
Mr. Reeser.
Here.
Mr. Springs,
I make a motion that we suspend the reading of the minutes.
seconded by
I'll
Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSalma, Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Reeser is an affirmative vote. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move to administrative reports. The mayor is not joining us tonight. He has prior obligations. He did submit a report in writing to members of council. So, and then he indicated in that report that Mr. Henry would have some requests as related to the Shade Tree Commission. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Henry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, members of council. Just a few items this evening that I'd like to report on. First is street striping. That's an ongoing item that we're doing here this week. You probably have noticed on several of the major highways or streets, the striping is already new. So I would just ask for the public to be cognizant of those vehicles as they're operating around in the city and try to avoid the freshly painted areas as much as possible. You'll notice the machine, of course, but they'll lay down a cone as they go every so often to indicate where the fresh paint has been laid down. So try to avoid those areas. Leaf pickup is ongoing throughout the city. I really noticed the last few days here, it's started to drop more heavily. Some of the trees that hold on longer have started to even come down. So I just wanted to put that out there that we're still going to be picking up for at least a couple of more weeks now and probably even longer than that. So I would encourage you, if you do have leaves at your property, to still rake them out as close to the road as you can without going into the roadway and also without blocking the sidewalk. We'll get around to them again. If you're wondering if we'll get back to your neighborhood, we probably will. We actually run 3 trucks quite a bit throughout the fall here. So you see one in your neighborhood, there's actually 1 or 2 probably others throughout the other part of the city too that's still operating. So get your leaves out. Wanted to just make a quick public announcement that our city offices, other than police and fire, of course, will be closed tomorrow. As Mr. Reeser indicated, tomorrow is Veterans Day, and our offices are closed in observance of that important holiday. Then lastly, as President Wagner mentioned, I have a request from the mayor that the members of council give a voice approval for the reappointment of Sue Cheney to the Tree Commission. Her appointment expires here on November the 16th. That's a 3-year term, if you're wondering how long the term is for the appointment. So the mayor would like to request that somebody motion to reappoint Sue Cheney to that commission, please.
I have a motion to appoint or reappoint Sue Cheney to a 3-year term to the Shade Tree Commission. I have a motion by Councilwoman Baker, second by Mr. DeSalma.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSalma, Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma was affirmative for the record.
Thank you for that. We appreciate that. Sue's a valued member of that commission, so we're glad to have her appointed back. Thank you. That ends my report, Mr. President, unless there are questions.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. Any questions for Mr. Henry? Seeing none, we'll move to Law Director, Mr. Stolle.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Council, good evening. Members of administration, I'm reporting high atop Rush Avenue here in Bellefontaine. I apologize for the glare on these office lights on my head. Avert your eyes if you're blinded. You'll see a number of pieces of legislation for this evening. Kudos go to Mr. Brentlinger and the auditor's office for preparing most of the financial packages that we're presenting for 2021. So we're going to see a lot of year-end legislation that is an annual ongoing. So if there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer those, but I'm sure Finance Committee and Fred were able to discuss those at our earlier Zoom meeting. But just if you have any requests for year-end items, if we've missed something, it does happen, just let me know and be glad to prepare legislation and get us in a good position for 2021. That ends my report.
Thank you, Mr. Stolle. Any questions for Mr. Stolle? Seeing none, we'll move to Auditor's Report, Mr. Brentlinger.
Thank you, Mr. President. As Mr. Stolle said, there are several year-end ordinances on the agenda tonight. We did talk about them in length in Finance Committee, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Any questions for Mr. Brentlinger? Seeing none, I believe, well, we have Parks and Rec. Chris, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Actually, I do have just two quick items. One would be, I would point your attention, if you have a chance to drive down Lake Avenue, over by where the soccer fields are in Blue Jacket Park there. This afternoon, we worked with Bellefontaine City Schools to erect a Veterans Day recognition. There are 525 individual flags with service members, veterans' names on those flags displayed out there at the park. And that's going to be up through this weekend. It's something we're really proud to be able to work with the city schools on. We think it's a great way to recognize our veterans here in town. So just get a chance, check it out. It's really moving, I think. So just wanted to share that with you. And then two, if you have an opportunity to come out to Myra and check out the construction progress on the stairway and bridges, the stairway is decked down, and we're really hopeful that we're on schedule to meet our completion date by the December 8th. So really excited for that project. If anybody wants to go out and check it out and wants me to be there, I'd be happy to meet you there. So thanks. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. Any questions or comments from Mr. Myers? Seeing none, we'll move to reports of standing committees. Finance Committee, Mrs. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have several ordinances for first reading, as the law director and the auditor both talked about. The first one is 2080, and that is the temporary appropriations for the current expenses for 2021. This doesn't include any salary increases at this point because we are just entering into the negotiation stage with the two union groups. So it doesn't show any of those unless there is a step increase or a class change that would warrant an increase in the salary at this point. Also has no capital equipment purchases. We started doing this, I think just last year, where we pulled that out of the temporary budget, and then we'll be putting those things in back when we get to the permanent. The general fund total is $9,992,695. Total appropriations in the temporary are $27,585,901. Just having trouble reading my writing there. So we'll be asking for first reading only on that one. Then the next three ordinances, 2083, 2081, 2082, and 2083 are ordinances that for the compensation packages for the first one is clerical workers for 2021. And the next one is the service workers for 2021, and then the supervisory wage schedule for 2021. These are the same thing, that no increases in wages are reflected in these at this time, but it does show if there are any step or class increases. We'll be asking for first reading only on each one of those. Ordinance 2084 is the compensation package for the mayor, president of council, council members, the clerk of council, the law director, treasurer, auditor in the city here. So these are no changes for 2021 or 2020. Those salaries stay the same right at this point in time, but this we'll be asking for first reading only on that one. And then let's see, 2085 is the compensation package for the municipal court judge position. That salary is set by the Ohio Supreme Court. And so there was a change in that last year that went to $143,701 plus an additional $1,500 for serving as the administrative court judge. So that total is $145,201 for 2021. That's set by the Supreme Court, but the actual amount that comes from our county is $61,700, of which 60% of that comes out of the city budget, and then 40 for the county. We'll be asking for first reading only on that one as well. 2086 is to go out to for the contract for the water treatment plant sludge thickener. I don't know, it seems like they should come up with maybe a little prettier name there. That doesn't sound very appealing there, but this was already in our 2020 budget, and it's something that we had pushed back till we could see how things were going to come out here for this year. But with a couple other things that we purchased out of that, we were able to get that. The price went up, of course, over this year, but with the savings from some of the other things that were already appropriated, we're going to be able to go ahead and get that out of the wastewater capital equipment fund at a cost of about $175,000, and that will be first reading only as well. And then we have one ordinance that is up for adoption this evening, and that's the supplemental for the painting project that is ongoing right now. So we'll be asking for adoption on that this evening. I'd also like to make a little report. Actually, Councilwoman James had asked me a question since she's new on council, and she hears that, you know, we are asking to go out to be able to accept grants or go out to apply for grants. She was just asking what our rate of success is on those. So I reached out to both the police department and the fire department, and I got just a couple little things here that I wanted to share. With the police department, they have about a 90% success rate of going after grants and being able to achieve those over the last couple years. The grants over just the last couple years that the police department has been able to secure is about $215,000. And Danielle Meek is the one who does most of the grant writing for the police department, and does a really good job with that. So I just wanted to give her kudos for that. And then in the fire department, as we well know, some of their equipment is like crazy expensive, but they have had about an 80% success rate, totaling $354,000. But actually, the one that was a failure at one point was rewritten the next year, and we got it. So it ended up that everything that they had applied for that they did get. So and they're using a professional grant writer now. So our success rate has improved considerably. A couple things that are coming up that, you know, keep the special thoughts for this, but the they're a grant for the aerial ladder. That's a $950,000 grant. So that would make us a really good path toward a new ladder truck, which, you know, the saga of that, the issues that we've had with that, that's over $1 million item. So, but this would be a really big chunk of that. So we're still hoping that we can be successful with that. And then another one for some rescue tool project, and that's $66,000. So we're hoping that. Just a couple meetings ago, we voted on the State Fire Marshal Marks grant. The maximum is $50,000, but we know we won't be getting that, so it'll be somewhere under that. But just with those three things right there, it's over $1 million. If we could just get the two, that would be great. But we know we'll get a little bit from the State Fire Marshal. So I just wanted to report that. I felt that we had a good rate of success on that. But when Mrs. James asked me about it, I thought, I'm just going to go to the guys who will really be able to tell me. And I was real happy with the report. So just wanted to share that with all of you. That ends my report, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. Any questions for Mrs. Baker? I just have one question for Fred as it relates to Mrs. Baker's report. When we were looking at the temporary budget numbers of the total general revenue fund coming in close to 10 million, and the total appropriations being about 27.5 million. How do those numbers reflect based on the last budget, Fred?
Well, the permanent budget for 2020, this total budget, the total temporary, is down about $1.1 million on that. However, in the permanent budget for 2020, we had in capital equipment of 1.2 million in there. So taking out the capital, it's fairly flat compared to the prior year.
Okay. Thank you. Rules Committee, Mr. Kurtz.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rules Committee has two ordinances on the agenda this evening. The first is 20-87. It's up for first reading. It's an ordinance to change some zoning classifications from R1, which is one family residence, to R3, which is multifamily residence. And we'll be asking for passage on first reading only. And the second ordinance on the agenda for Rules Committee tonight is up for adoption. And it's the ordinance to amend the codified ordinances regarding penalties for moving violations. And we'll just be asking for adoption on that. And that ends my report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kurtz. Any questions for Mr. Kurtz? Seeing none, we'll move to Safety Committee, Mr. Lau.
Thank you, Mr. President. I only have one. I have no report, but I do have a statement here. I wanted to ask Service Director, is this the right time to do that? I'm concerned.
You do that in the communications from council at the end of our meeting.
That'll be fine. I have no report. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lau. Utilities Committee, Mr. Springs.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report.
Thank you, Mr. Springs. Streets Committee, Mr. DeSoma. Mr. DeSoma, your microphone is muted. There you go.
Now?
I got you.
Okay. I'm sorry. We have one ordinance for second reading. It's to vacate a certain alley on the Ritter allotment between lots 3529 and 3531. That's for second reading only. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeSoma. Sidewalks, Curbs, and Parks Committee, Mr. Reeser.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think Mr. Myers covered all the things that I was going to say, so I have no report.
Stole your thunder. Thank you, Mr. Reeser. Audit Committee, Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report.
Thank you, Mrs. James. That concludes our reports to standing committees. We'll now move to the portion of our meeting where we welcome communications from citizens. Prior to our meeting today, the clerk informed me that there were no communications from citizens. Again, just want to remind everybody out there that if you want to comment or provide any feedback to council, we encourage you to do so. You have to submit those comments in writing, which need to be received by the clerk by 6:00 p.m. Sunday before council session. So with no communications from citizens, we'll now move to our legislative agenda and ordinances for first reading.
Ordinance making temporary appropriations for current expenses and other expenses during the fiscal year beginning January 1st, 2021 and ending December 21st, 2021, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yeah.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, 2021 clerical workers pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, 2021 service workers pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle, Mr. Lyle,
I think Mr. Lyle's frozen. What?
Oh,
Thumbs up
okay.
from Mr. Lyle.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, 2021 supervisory wage ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for the mayor, president of council, council members, clerk of council, law director, treasurer, and auditor, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. Springs,
No.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation of the Bellefontaine Municipal Court Judge for 2021 and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the service safety director to seek proposals and/or advertise for bids and enter into contract with the selected contractor and/or bidders for the city of Bellefontaine wastewater treatment plant sludge thickener project number 2020-06 and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
Seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
yes,
Mr. Lyle,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance changing the zoning classification of lots 2909 and 2910 and a 0.10 acre tract from R1, one family resident district to R3 multifamily residence district, amending the zoning map and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mr. Kurtz.
make a motion to pass on first reading only.
Seconded by Mr. DeSoma.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
I'll abstain from voting since I'm one of the property owners.
Abstention is accepted.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes,
Mr. Lyle,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for first reading. We'll now move to ordinances for second reading.
An ordinance vacating that certain public east-west alley of Ritter allotment between lots 3529 to 3531 on the north and lot 3532 on the south in the city of Bellefontaine, Lake Township, Logan County, Ohio, and declaring an emergency in said city.
I make a motion we pass on second reading only.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
yes,
Mr. Lyle,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for second reading. We'll now move to ordinances for third reading.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of paint and materials, traffic lights and signs, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
yes,
Mr. Lyle,
yes,
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance amending section 335.99 of the codified ordinances of the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio regarding penalties for moving violations.
Mr. Kurtz.
I make a motion we adopt.
I'll second that.
Seconded by Mr. Lyle.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
yes,
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes,
Mr. Lyle,
Yes,
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for third reading and our legislative agenda this evening. We'll now move to communications from the clerk.
None for me, thank you.
Okay, now we'll move to communications from council. Mr. Lyle.
thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. The current concerns I have is I had a couple of people call the blockades. This is for David to answer. The blockades are going from Detroit Street under the bar, the vault, and then boards are still hanging. Coming to winter, you know, they're going to get snow. They're going to come down. Have we got something done with that? Do you know?
Okay, I was aware that the barricades were there. I was wondering why they were there. Honestly, I had heard that the police department had requested that they be there. The only thing I can tell you, Mick, is I can check into it tomorrow and see where we're at as far as getting the repair completed. If there is an issue with the building, then Wes could contact the owner there. And I also have his personal information because I worked with him on the Dora since he is a vendor for that. So I can contact him as well and see where we're at. But I don't have a good answer for you as far as when it's going to get done.
I think the concerns is just the boards are still loose and the barricades are gone. And I thought, well, it hadn't been fixed, so that hadn't taken care of. So appreciate that. Just let me know.
Will do.
Thank you.
Any other communications from members of council? Seeing none, we'll entertain a motion and a second to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Seconded by Mr. Reeser. We're adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.